On the night of January 10th, 1904, the temperature in Box Butte County, Nebraska, dropped to 41 below zero. The wind came out of the north like something that had been caged and set free, screaming across the sandhills with enough force to snap fence posts and bury cattle standing upright in the fields. 15 people huddled inside a structure the entire county had spent 6 months calling the pig pen. The walls were 2 feet thick, they were made of straw, and they were holding. Elias Croft stood near the door with his 3-year-old daughter pressed against his chest. His lips were cracked, his fingers were white. 6 months earlier, he had looked at the man who built this house and said, with the certainty of a man who had buried 2 children to the cold, "That baby is going to freeze to death in your arms, and there will not be a thing you can do to stop it." Now Elias Croft was alive because of that man's house. His daughter was alive. His wife was alive. But here is the thing no one in that room knew yet. The straw bales that held the walls together, the bales that kept 15 souls breathing through the worst blizzard in a decade, had not been abandoned by some careless rancher. They had been pressed and stacked 11 years earlier by a man named Ephraim Croft, Elias's father, the man who froze to death in the blizzard of 1893. But that revelation was still hours away. And to understand what it meant, you need to go back to the beginning. Back to a summer day when a young man with $17 and a pregnant wife stood on 640 acres of nothing and tried to figure out how not to die. Silas Drummond arrived in Box Butte County in June of 1903 with a wagon, a mule, a pregnant wife named Lenora, and $17 in his pocket. The Kincaid Act had opened the sandhills to homesteading just weeks before, and Silas had been one of 400 people lined up at the Alliance Land Office on the first day of claims. He stood in that line for 2 days. When he finally reached the clerk's window, he learned he had been granted 640 acres of grass-covered sand dunes 18 miles south of town. On paper, it sounded like wealth. In reality, Silas Drummond had acquired 18 miles of wind-scoured nothing. No trees, no water well, no shelter. No neighbors close enough to hear a scream. Lenora was 7 months along. The baby would come in August. Winter would come in November. That gave Silas 5 months to build a house, dig a well, and stockpile enough fuel to keep his family alive until spring. He tried everything. He dug a well, and the sandy soil collapsed at 4 feet. He borrowed a breaking plow and cut sod bricks from the creek bed. The bricks crumbled overnight. The sand content was too high. He walked 18 miles to Alliance and asked about buying lumber on credit. The yard owner laughed in his face. A basic frame house required $200 in materials. Silas had 17. He had a pregnant wife. He had 5 months. And on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, he had a visitor. Elias Croft rode up on a dun mare and studied the empty claim the way a doctor might study a dying patient. Croft had homesteaded this stretch of sand in 1891. He had lost his first wife to the blizzard of 93. He had lost 3 fingers to frostbite in 97. He had buried 2 children who did not survive their first sandhills winter. He knew what the prairie could do to a man who came unprepared. "You planning to build?" Croft asked. Silas nodded. "Got my wife in the wagon. Baby coming in August." Croft was quiet for a long moment. His eyes held no cruelty. That was the thing Silas would remember later. There was no malice in what Croft said next. There was only the flat, exhausted certainty of a man who had watched this story play out before and knew how it ended. "A frame house costs $200 minimum," Croft said. "Sod here will not stack. Sand is too loose." He paused. "You got a stove? What are you planning to burn in it?" There is no wood within 60 miles. Silas said nothing. Croft pulled his hat lower against the wind. A man alone might survive out here on grit and stubbornness, but a woman with a newborn. He shook his head. Get her back to Alliance before the snow flies. Find work. Come back in spring with real money. This is my claim, Silas said. I am not leaving it. Croft looked at him the way you look at a man walking toward a cliff edge in the dark. Then you best make your peace with God, he said, because that baby is going to freeze to death in your arms, and there will not be a thing you can do to stop it. He rode off without another word, and Silas Drummond spent his first week on the claim learning how wrong he had been about everything. His hands bled from digging. His back screamed from hauling. The sod bricks slumped into shapeless lumps. Lenora watched from the wagon, her belly growing larger while her husband grew smaller. $17. A pregnant wife. 4.5 months until winter. And now he could not build a sod house, could not afford lumber, could not even dig a well that held water. On a night in early July, after Lenora had fallen asleep in the wagon, Silas walked out onto the prairie alone. He walked until the wagon was a dark speck behind him, until the wind was the only sound, until he could have screamed and no one would have heard. He did not scream. He sat down in the grass and stared at the stars and tried to imagine what it would feel like to watch his child freeze. That is when he saw them. 200 bales of prairie grass, stacked near the creek bed, abandoned and weathering. Some rancher had baled the grass the previous fall and never come back for it. The bales were discolored, bleached on top and dark underneath. They smelled like old hay and defeat. But Silas Drummond was not looking at hay. He was looking at blocks. Dense, compressed blocks, roughly 2 feet by 2 feet by 4 feet. Heavy, tight, stackable. He pressed his hand against the nearest bale. The straw was dry inside, only the outer inches damaged by weather. And in that moment, sitting in the dark with desperation stripping away everything he thought he knew, Silas remembered something his father had taught him back in Ohio, how a thick straw tick held warmth through the coldest night, how the hayloft was always warmer than the house, how each stalk of straw was a tiny tube of trapped air, and trapped air was the finest insulation God ever made. What if you took that warmth and made it into walls? The thought was insane. Walls made of hay, a house made of animal feed, the kind of thing a foolish pig might build in a children's story. But Silas had no money for bricks, no soil for sod, no trees for logs, no credit for lumber. What he had was 200 free bales of abandoned straw, a pregnant wife, and 4 months to figure out how not to let his family die. He grabbed a bale by its twine and dragged it back toward the wagon. By morning, he had hauled 30 bales to the campsite. His shoulders burned, his hands were raw, but his mind was racing, sketching walls in the dust with a stick while Lenora boiled coffee over a chip fire. She looked at the bales. She looked at her husband. She looked at the rectangle he had drawn in the dirt. "You are going to build us a house," she said. It was not a question. "Out of straw," Silas said. Bales laid flat, stacked like bricks, staggered joints, 2 feet thick, stakes driven through to hold them, plaster on the outside to keep weather out. "Will it work?" "I do not know." Silas met her eyes. "But I know we will freeze in the wagon. I know we cannot afford lumber. I know the sod will not stack." He pointed at the bales. "This is what we have. So this is what we use." Lenora was quiet. Her hand rested on her belly where their child kicked against her palm. Then she nodded once. "Show me how to help." Word spread fast across the empty prairie. Within 2 days, every homesteader within 20 miles knew that the new Kincaid man was building his house out of hay bales. The reactions came in waves. First disbelief, then amusement, then something harder, something closer to anger. If a man could build a house from straw, then what did that say about the men who had spent $200 on lumber? So the county decided the man was a fool, and they waited for the prairie to prove them right. Niels Bergstrom rode over on the third day. Bergstrom was a Swede who had come to Nebraska in the 80s, back when men still believed the government's promise that rain would follow the plow. He had seen 3 droughts, 2 locust plagues, and more dead homesteaders than he cared to count. He was the closest thing Box Butte County had to a building expert. He had helped raise a dozen sod houses and 2 frame structures in his time. He found Silas driving wooden stakes down through a knee-high wall of straw bales. The stakes were willow branches cut from the creek bed, sharpened to points. Silas had drilled starter holes through the bales with a borrowed auger and was hammering the stakes down with a mallet, pinning each course to the one below. Bergstrom watched in silence for a long moment. Then he dismounted, walked to the wall, and pushed against it with both hands. The wall did not move. He walked around it, examining the joints where bales met, the way Silas had staggered them, the stakes protruding from the top course. He crouched and looked at the bottom course where it met the earth, checking for gaps, for shifting, for any sign of weakness. There was none. "It is holding," Bergstrom admitted. "It will hold better when I get the roof plate on and plaster the outside," Silas said. He did not stop working. 5 months had become 4 months. He could not afford to stop. Bergstrom crouched and peered at the bales. "You know, straw rots when it gets wet. That is why I am plastering it. Plaster cracks, water gets in. Then I will fix the cracks." Silas drove another stake. Every house needs maintenance. Sod houses grow mushrooms in the walls. Frame houses let in drafts. Nothing is perfect. Bergstrom stood up and brushed dust from his knees. "I have seen a lot of men try strange things out here. Dugouts that collapsed. Sod houses that melted in spring rains. Frame houses built so loose the wind blew the fire out." He studied the wall, his expression unreadable. "I have never seen anyone try to build with hay. Straw, whatever you call it. It is not a building material. It is fodder. The cows are going to think you have built them a feed trough." He shook his head slowly. "First hard wind is going to scatter those bales across the county. And when winter comes," Silas said quietly, "I will be inside with my wife and child. And we will find out if it works." Bergstrom was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth bundle. "My wife sent these," he said. "Pickled beets. She heard your woman was expecting." Silas stopped hammering. He looked at the bundle, then at Bergstrom. "Tell her thank you." Bergstrom mounted his horse. "I hope it works, Drummond. I truly do. But when that baby comes, and you realize you have built a house that will not hold heat, you bring them to my place. We have got room. Nobody needs to die for pride." He rode off. Silas watched him go. Then he turned back to the wall and drove another stake. Other visitors were less kind. A group of 3 young men from Alliance rode out on a Sunday afternoon the following week. They sat on their horses in a half circle and watched Silas work and passed a bottle between them and laughed the way men laugh when they are performing for each other. The tallest one, a red-faced boy named Wick Saunders, who worked at the feedlot, called out across the claim, "Hey, Drummond, when does the wolf come to blow it down?" Silas did not look up. He was laying the 5th course, lifting 60-pound bales to chest height and settling them into place with a precision that came from desperation rather than skill. Each bale had to sit exactly right. Each joint had to be staggered. He could not afford a single mistake. Saunders tried again. I got $1 says it does not last till October. Anyone want to take that bet? The other two laughed. One of them tossed a coin in the air and caught it. I say September. First good rain washes that mud right off and the whole thing falls like a deck of cards. They sat there for 20 minutes. Silas did not speak to them. He did not look at them. He laid bales and drove stakes, and the sweat ran down his face and soaked through his shirt and dripped onto the straw, where it disappeared into the compressed grass as if it had never existed. Eventually, the young men grew bored with a man who would not perform for them. They rode off toward town, and Silas could hear their laughter fading across the prairie long after they disappeared. Lenora had watched from the wagon. She did not ask if the words had hurt. She already knew. Instead, she said, "The wall looks straight. You have a good eye." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to him in weeks. August came with brutal heat, and the baby came with it. Lenora's labor lasted 14 hours. It began before dawn when she woke Silas with a hand on his arm and a voice that was steady despite the fear behind it. "It is time," she said. The walls were 3 feet high around them, and the roof was open sky, and the nearest doctor was 18 miles away, and there was nothing to be done about any of it. Silas paced outside the half-finished structure while Dorrit Croft, Elias's second wife, a silent woman who never mentioned how she had come to replace the first, delivered his son in the back of the wagon. Dorrit had come without being asked. She had appeared at dawn on a mule, carrying a clean cloth bundle and a kettle of boiled water, and she had said only 2 words to Silas before climbing into the wagon: "Stay outside." The boy was small but healthy. They named him Emmett, after Silas's grandfather, a man who had cleared timber in Ohio with his bare hands and built a cabin from the wood and lived in it for 40 years. A man who understood that shelter was not something you bought, it was something you made. Silas held his son for the first time as the sun set over the sandhills. The boy weighed almost nothing. His fingers were smaller than matchsticks. His eyes were closed and his mouth was open and his lungs were pulling Nebraska air for the first time. And Silas Drummond held that 6-pound body against his chest and made a promise he was not sure he could keep. "You will not freeze. I will not let you freeze." The walls were 3 feet high. The window openings were cut, but the roof was not framed. The plaster was not applied. Winter was 3 months away. Silas went back to work the next morning with bleeding hands and a newborn's cry ringing in his ears. It was Lenora who found the dog. 3 days after Emmett was born, she walked to the creek to wash linens and heard a sound that stopped her cold. A thin, broken whimpering coming from behind the cottonwood stand near the dump site, where homesteaders left their rusted equipment and broken tools. She followed the sound and found a dog tied to a fence post with a length of frayed rope. The animal was a male, medium build, copper-colored with a white blaze on his chest. His ribs showed through his coat like fingers pressing under a blanket. His water dish was empty and bone dry. The rope had worn a raw ring around his neck where he had pulled and pulled and pulled against it, and the ground around the post was scratched bare from his pacing. Someone had tied him there and walked away. Maybe a week ago, maybe longer. The post was near the dump site, the place where homesteaders left the things they no longer wanted. Lenora knelt beside him. The dog did not growl. He did not bark. He pressed his head against her hand and shook, and she could feel every bone in his skull. She cut the rope with her kitchen knife and carried him back to the wagon. Silas looked at the dog, then at his wife, then at the dog again. "Lenora, we can barely feed ourselves." She said nothing. She set the dog down beside the wagon, and the dog walked directly to the makeshift cradle where Emmett slept and lay down beside it. Not on it, not near it, beside it, close enough to touch. And then he rested his chin on his paws and watched the baby with the steady, patient attention of a creature who had finally found something worth guarding. Silas stared at the dog for a long time. The dog stared back. "He is staying," Lenora said. They called him Copper for his coat. And within a week, it became clear that the name was the least important thing about him. Copper did not leave Emmett's side. When Lenora nursed the baby, Copper lay at her feet. When Silas worked on the walls, Copper positioned himself between the cradle and the open prairie, watching the horizon with ears pricked forward. At night, he curled beside the baby, and his body heat kept the chill off the infant in ways that blankets alone could not. He growled exactly once in that first week. Silas heard it at dawn, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. He looked up and saw a coyote standing 40 yards out, studying the camp. Copper was on his feet, his body rigid, that growl building in his chest like something mechanical. The coyote stared at the dog. The dog stared back. The coyote left. Silas added a handful of cornmeal to Copper's water that evening. He did not say anything to Lenora about it. He did not need to. The walls reached their full height by early September, 7 feet on the sides, 9 feet at the gables. Silas had used all 200 bales from the creek bed, and another 100 he cut and baled himself from his own claim with a rented horse press. 300 bales in total. The structure was 16 feet by 20 feet, large enough for a bed, a stove, a table, and room to move. From outside, it looked like a giant block of matted grass. But Silas could see what it would become. He could see the plaster smooth on the walls and the smoke curling against a winter sky, and Lenora inside with Emmett, warm and safe, while the county shook its head. He could see it because he had to see it. Harlan Sloan rode out to see it on September 3rd. Sloan ran the general store in Alliance. He was not a man who made social calls. He was a man who collected debts, extended credit to those who could repay it, and watched with cold eyes as those who could not lost everything. He had bought out the claims of 3 failed homesteaders already that year. Silas owed him $11 for supplies: flour, salt, a second-hand stove, and the nails for the roof frame. Sloan circled the structure on horseback, his face expressing nothing. He took his time. He looked at the walls, the way a man looks at a card hand he knows he can beat. "This what you have been building?" he asked. Silas was on the roof, laying cottonwood poles across the gaps between the gable walls. "This is it." Sloan dismounted and studied the straw walls the way a banker might study a bad investment. He did not touch them. He did not push against them. He just looked. "You owe me $11, Drummond. You have until October 1st. That was our agreement. I will have it. Will you?" Sloan's eyes moved from the walls to Silas and back. "Because what I see here is a man who spent his summer building a pig's house instead of proving his claim. I see a man with a newborn baby and no proper shelter. I see a man who is going to come to me in November, hat in hand, begging for credit he cannot repay." Silas climbed down from the roof. His hands were blistered. His arms were scratched from the straw. His face was sunburned from weeks of outdoor labor. He stood in front of Harlan Sloan, and he did not flinch, and he did not look away. "What is your point, Sloan?" Sloan smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "My point is that I have a standing offer on this claim. Grover Tate wants to run cattle out here. He will pay $50 for your quitclaim deed today. Cash in hand. You clear your debt, have enough left to get back to Ohio, and you do not have to watch that baby freeze when your hay house falls apart. $50. It was more money than Silas had seen in 6 months. It was enough to admit defeat and walk away. It was also everything he had worked for. handed over to a man who had laughed at him for not having cash. "I am not selling." Sloane's smile did not waver. "You say that now, but I have seen a lot of men say a lot of things out here. Pride keeps them going through summer. Pride keeps them going through fall. Then winter comes, and pride freezes solid." He mounted his horse. "I will be back in November, Drummond. We will see how you feel then." He paused at the edge of the claim and turned back. "One more thing. I took the liberty of writing to your family in Ohio. Your father ought to know his grandchild is living in a haystack. A man's people deserve the truth, even when the man himself cannot face it." Then he rode off toward Alliance. Silas stood very still. The wind pressed against the straw walls and moved through the grass and carried Sloane's words across the empty prairie where they settled like poison. His father, Silas's father, back in Ohio. The man who had taught him about straw ticks and haylofts and trapped air. The man whose knowledge had given Silas the only idea he had. That man was going to receive a letter from Harlan Sloane telling him that his son had built a house out of garbage and was raising a baby in it. And his father would not be able to see the walls, would not be able to press his hand against the plaster and feel the stillness of the air inside, would not be able to check the thermometer and see what trapped air could do. All his father would have was Sloane's words. His son was a fool. His grandson was in danger. And the knowledge he had passed down, the knowledge about straw and warmth and insulation, had been twisted into proof of madness. That night, after Lenora had nursed Emmett and Copper had settled beside the cradle, Silas walked out onto the prairie alone. He sat in the grass and stared at the half-finished house, and for the first time since he had found the bales, he considered giving up. Not because of the cold, not because of the debt, not because of Sloane or Tate or any of the men who had laughed and pointed and called it the pig pen, because of his father. Because Silas could survive the scorn of strangers. He could not survive the thought that the man who had given him everything he knew might believe that knowledge had been wasted on a fool. $50. Enough to pay the debt. Enough for train tickets. Enough to walk back into his father's house in Ohio and say, "I tried and it did not work, and at least the baby is alive." His father would nod, his mother would cry, and Silas would spend the rest of his life knowing that he had held the answer in his hands and let it go. He did not hear Lenora come outside. He did not hear her footsteps in the grass. He only felt her hand on his shoulder, and then she was sitting beside him, the night air cool against their skin, the stars thick and indifferent above them. She did not ask what was wrong. She already knew. "Your father taught you about the straw," she said. "Yes." "He taught you what it could do, how it holds warmth, how it traps the air." "Yes." "But you are not building this house because your father taught you." Lenora's voice was quiet, but certain. "You are building it because you listened. Because when he talked about haylofts and straw ticks and trapped air, you heard something that no one else heard. You heard a house." She paused. "That is not his gift, Silas. That is yours. He did not teach you to build. He taught you to pay attention. And you did. And that is why we are going to live." Silas sat in the dark for a long time after she went inside. Copper came out and lay beside him, warm and breathing, and the two of them watched the stars move across the prairie sky. Then Silas stood up. He went back to work. He plastered by moonlight. He could not afford to hire help. He could not afford proper cement or lime. What he could do was mix the gumbo clay from the creek bed with water and prairie grass, creating a thick mud that he spread across the straw walls with his bare hands. The work was brutal. The clay was heavy, 50 pounds per bucket, and it had to be carried from the creek bed to the house, 120 yards, bucket by bucket. Silas made the trip 40 times a day. His shoulders knotted. His lower back seized so badly on the third day that he had to stand still for 10 minutes before he could straighten. His hands cracked and bled from the alkaline clay. Lenora helped when Emmett slept. They worked until midnight, slept for 4 hours, woke before dawn, and worked again. Some mornings, Silas found Lenora already at the creek bed, filling buckets in the dark, her nightgown tucked into her boots, her breath visible in the September chill. She never complained. She never asked how much longer. When Emmett cried, she stopped and nursed him, and then she went back to the clay. The plaster went on in layers. First coat rough, pressed into the straw to grip the stems. Silas used his fingers to work the mud into the gaps between bales, pushing it deep until he could feel the compressed grass resist. Second coat smoother, filling the gaps and hollows left by the first. Third coat almost slick, a finishing layer thick enough to shed rain, applied with the flat of his palm in long sweeping strokes that left the surface looking like something between stone and dried riverbed. Each wall took 3 days. There were 4 walls. 12 days of work that left Silas unable to close his hands into fists and Lenora with a cough that would not clear until October. By September 20th, the exterior was sealed. Silas stood back and looked at what they had built, and for the first time in months, he felt something other than fear. The structure did not look like a pile of straw anymore. It looked like a house. Rough, lumpy, unpainted, but solid. The walls were nearly 2 feet thick. The mud had hardened in the September sun, forming a shell that rang when he knocked on it. A clean, solid sound. The sound of something that intended to stay. It was while plastering the northwest corner that Silas noticed something on the binding twine of one of the bales. Faded pencil marks, almost invisible against the weathered fiber. He leaned closer and brushed away dried mud. EC Lot 12, 1892. Someone had numbered these bales. Someone with the initials EC had pressed and stacked them on Lot 12 11 years ago and marked each one with a careful hand. The pencil strokes were deliberate, not hurried. Whoever had written them had taken the time to form each letter clearly, the way a person does when they expect someone to read the writing later. Silas ran his thumb across the letters. Who was EC? What had happened to him? Why had the bales been left to weather by the creek for over a decade? He did not know. He filed the question away and went back to plastering. But what Silas Drummond did not know, could not have known, was that those 2 letters would change the meaning of everything that was about to happen. And the man who had written them had died less than a mile from where Silas now stood, frozen solid in the blizzard of 1893, 11 years before his straw saved 15 lives. Silas sold the wagon to pay Harlan Sloan. He found a buyer in Alliance, a newcomer even greener than he had been, a man with cash and no sense who paid $15 for a wagon worth $20. Silas walked the 18 miles home with the money in his pocket and his boots wearing thin. The soles were separating from the uppers on the left boot. He could feel the road through the gap. 18 miles of feeling the road. He paid Sloan on October 1st, exactly as promised. Sloan took the coins without comment, counted them twice, and wrote a receipt on a scrap of paper. Paid in full, Sloan said. For now, but you will need supplies come January. Salt, flour, medicine maybe. And I do not extend credit to men who live in haystacks. Silas pocketed the receipt. I will figure it out. You have no wagon, no mule, no money. You have 18 miles between here and town, and in January, that is 18 miles of frozen death. How exactly do you plan to survive until spring? One day at a time, Silas said. He walked out of Sloane's store and began the long walk home. The walk took him 5 hours. He arrived after dark. Lenora had left a lamp in the window of the straw house. It was the first time she had done that, left a light burning for him, and when Silas saw it glowing through the small south-facing glass, he stopped in the road and looked at it for a long time. It was just a lamp, just a wick burning in oil behind a pane of glass. But it was burning inside his house. The house he had built with straw and mud and willow stakes, and everything his father had ever taught him about the warmth that lives inside things that look like nothing. He walked the last quarter mile with that light in his eyes, and when he opened the door, the warmth hit him, and Copper raised his head from beside the cradle, and Lenora looked up from her mending and said, "You paid him?" "Every cent." Silas sat down in the chair beside the stove and pulled off his ruined boots and held his feet toward the heat and felt the ache of the road slowly dissolve. "We owe nobody anything." Dorrit Croft came to the claim on September 26th with a wagon full of cow chips and a proposition. "My husband says your house is foolish," she said. "He says you are going to freeze and your wife is going to freeze and that baby is going to freeze and there is nothing to be done about it." She climbed down from the wagon. She was a small woman, weathered by years on the prairie, with eyes that had seen things she never talked about. "I think my husband has been wrong before." She gestured at the fuel stacked high in the bed. "That is 3 months of chips. More than enough to keep a small stove running through winter if you are careful." She paused. "I am not giving them to you. I do not give charity. But I will trade." "Trade for what?" "That mule of yours. He is old, but he is sound. My draft horse threw a shoe and the hoof has gone bad. Will not make it through winter." Silas thought about his mule. He would need it come spring to plow, to haul water, to drag timber if he ever got timber. But spring was a long way off, and without fuel, there would not be a spring. Deal. They unloaded the chips together, stacking them against the east wall where they would stay dry. When they finished, Silas handed over the mule's lead rope, and Dorrit climbed into her wagon. "For what it is worth," she said, "I hope you prove him wrong. I hope you prove all of them wrong." Then she drove off, leading his mule behind her. Silas watched the wagon until it disappeared over the first rise, and he stood there a moment longer in the silence that followed, thinking about a woman who believed her husband was wrong, but would never say it to his face. In the last days of September, Silas turned the structure into something that could be called a home. He built a bed frame from cottonwood poles lashed together with rawhide, and Lenora filled a tick with fresh prairie grass that smelled like summer and crackled when you lay down on it. He hung a shelf on the south wall for their few possessions. The family Bible, a tin box with their remaining coins, a photograph of Lenora's mother in a tarnished frame, a wooden spoon his father had carved as a wedding gift, the handle worn smooth from a decade of use. Lenora sewed a curtain for the window from a flour sack she had washed until the printing faded. She hung it with 2 nails and stood back and looked at it and said, "There, now it is a house." Copper had claimed his spot beside the cradle so completely that the floorboards there had worn smooth from his turning and settling. He slept with one ear cocked toward the door, and if the wind shifted or a coyote called too close, that ear would swivel and he would lift his head and listen until the sound passed. Then he would lower his chin back to his paws and return to his work of waiting. They fell into a routine. Silas rose before dawn and checked the stove and the fuel pile and the plaster for cracks. Lenora nursed Emmett and made coffee from ground she had boiled 3 times because they could not afford fresh. Copper went outside to patrol the perimeter of the claim in a wide circle, marking the corners with the territorial precision of an animal who understood property lines. Then Silas worked on whatever needed working on, the endless list of repairs and improvements that a new house demands, and Lenora washed and mended and cooked and cared for Emmett and talked to Copper in a low voice that the dog seemed to understand perfectly. It was a small life. It was a hard life. But it was theirs, and it was built on ground they owned and inside walls they had raised with their own hands. And there was a dignity in that which no amount of scorn from Harlan Sloan or laughter from Wick Saunders could diminish. October arrived and the nights grew cold and the wind grew sharp. And inside the straw house, something remarkable was happening. Silas had expected to burn fuel constantly, the way his father had back in Ohio. He had expected to wake in frozen darkness, stumble to the stove, coax flames to life, and hover there, shivering until the room reluctantly warmed. Instead, the house held heat the way a stone holds summer sun. The walls did not let cold in. The walls did not let warmth out. A small fire in the evening raised the temperature, and that temperature stayed. Not fading through the night the way it had in every other house Silas had ever known, but holding, steady, present. He began to test it. He let the fire die at midnight and checked the thermometer through the night. By dawn, the room had cooled perhaps 4 degrees from its evening high, and outside the temperature had fallen 20 degrees in the same period. The walls were doing something no wall Silas had ever known could do. They were remembering warmth. On the coldest October night, the temperature outside dropped to 12 degrees. Inside, without a fire, the house sat at 42. Silas checked the thermometer 3 times. He pressed his hand to the walls, felt the straw through the thin interior plaster, felt the impossible stillness of trapped air. His walls had no drafts. His walls had no joints. His walls were 2 feet of compressed air, 10,000 hollow stalks, each one a tiny barrier. And together they stopped the cold the way 10,000 soldiers stop an army. Copper lay beside the stove and exhaled a long, satisfied sigh that made Emmett gurgle in his cradle. Lenora looked at Silas. Silas looked at the thermometer. 12 degrees outside, 42 inside, no fire, $2 in materials, 300 bales of straw. His own labor and his wife's labor and a desperate gamble born on a dark night when he had nothing left but the memory of what his father had taught him about a hollow stalk of grass. The walls held. November brought the first real test. The storm came on the 12th, a bitter wind driving ice crystals horizontally across the prairie. Silas watched from the window, the single small window he had framed into the south wall, as the world turned white. Outside, the wind screamed. He could hear it battering against the walls, hurling snow against the plaster with a sound like thrown sand. Inside, the walls muffled everything. The scream became a murmur. The battering became a whisper. The temperature outside dropped to 11 below zero. Inside, with a small fire burning, the house held at 58 degrees. Silas added a log. The temperature climbed to 64 and stayed there. 3 logs, 64 degrees, 11 below zero outside. In his father's frame house back in Ohio, they would have burned half a cord in a single night to achieve the same result. Elias Croft came by after the storm. He did not knock. He just stood outside the door, his breath fogging in the 9-degree air, his eyes on the straw walls with their coating of ice-crusted plaster. Silas opened the door. Warm air spilled out into the cold. Croft's eyes widened. "You going to invite me in," he said, "or just stand there letting out your heat?" Silas stepped aside. Croft entered the house and stopped. He stood very still, like a man who has walked into a church and is not sure he belongs there. He looked at the walls. He looked at the small stove, its fire barely glowing. He looked at Lenora and Emmett, comfortable in their chairs, with no blankets piled around them. Copper raised his head from beside the cradle, studied Croft for a moment, then lowered it again. "It is warm," Croft said. "Yes. The stove is barely going. Does not need more than that." Croft walked to the nearest wall and pressed his palm flat against the plaster. He held it there for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at Silas. "I have buried people who froze in sod houses," Croft said. "I have buried people who froze in frame houses. I have buried people who had more fuel than you will burn all winter and still could not keep ahead of the cold." "How much did this cost you to build?" Silas thought about the bales, free, abandoned by the creek. The stakes, willow branches, also free. The plaster, creek mud, and labor. The only cash he had spent was on the tar paper for the roof, the nails for the frame, and the second-hand stove. "Maybe $2, not counting labor." Croft laughed. It was a short, harsh sound. $2. He shook his head. "I spent $200 on my first house. Frame lumber shipped from Chicago. Best construction money could buy." He looked at the straw walls. "Your house is warmer than mine ever was." He turned to leave. At the door he paused. He stood there for a long moment with his hand on the frame, as if there were something he wanted to say, but could not yet find the shape of it. Then he stepped out into the cold without another word. December came. The temperature dropped again. 10 below, 15 below, 20 below. The house held. Silas burned less fuel than he had ever burned in his life. The walls swallowed the cold the way a sponge swallows water, never letting it reach the interior. The small iron stove, fed with cow chips and occasional twisted hay, produced enough heat to keep the room at 60 degrees even when the world outside turned deadly. Emmett grew. He was 4 months old now, and he had begun to make sounds that were not crying, small experimental noises that filled the warm room like music. Lenora regained her strength. She moved through the house with a sureness that had not been there in the fall, a woman settling into a space she had decided to claim. Copper had filled out, his ribs no longer visible, his coat thick and glossy from the warmth of the house. He had grown proprietary about the doorway, positioning himself there whenever Silas opened it, blocking the cold with his body as if he understood what the walls were doing and had decided to help. Silas began to believe they might actually survive. Then the letter arrived. It came in mid-December, carried by a mail rider who made the 18-mile run from Alliance twice a month when the roads allowed. Silas saw the handwriting on the envelope and his chest tightened. It was his mother's hand, not his father's. His father always wrote the letters. His father's penmanship was precise and deliberate, each letter formed the way he formed a joint in woodworking, with care and patience, and the quiet pride of a man who believed that how you did a thing mattered as much as what you did. This letter was written in his mother's hand, and the letters trembled. Silas opened it standing outside in the cold because he already knew. He knew the way you know when a door that has always been open is suddenly closed. The way you know when a sound that has always been present, the ticking of a clock, the breathing of someone sleeping beside you, stops. His father had died on November 29th. A stroke. Quick, the letter said, as if that were a comfort. He did not suffer, his mother wrote. He was sitting in his chair by the stove. He had been reading. The book was still in his hands when I found him. Silas read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and stood in the December wind and looked at the straw house and felt something inside him collapse that no wall could hold. His father was dead. His father, who had taught him about straw ticks and haylofts, who had shown him how a hollow stalk trapped air and how trapped air held warmth, who had spent decades heating a frame house with cord after cord of wood, and never once thought to ask whether there was a better way. His father had given Silas every piece of knowledge that made this house possible, and now his father would never stand inside it, would never press his hand against the wall and feel the stillness, would never check the thermometer and see 42 degrees without a fire, and understand that his son had listened, truly listened, to every word he had ever said. And worse, the letter from Sloan. Silas's mother made no mention of it. Had it arrived before his father died? Had his father read it? Had the last thing his father learned about his son been Harlan Sloan's version of the truth? That his boy was a fool who had built a haystack and was raising a baby in it? The not knowing was worse than any answer could have been. His father had died proud of him, or ashamed of him, or without knowing anything at all. And Silas could not close the distance between those possibilities because his father was gone, and the dead do not answer questions. Silas did not go inside. He walked out onto the prairie, past the stacked cow chips, past the creek bed where he had mixed his plaster, out into the open white nothing where the wind cut through his coat and the cold burned his face and the sky was the color of iron. Copper followed him. The dog did not bark or whine. He simply walked beside Silas through the snow, his copper coat dark against the white ground, his breath making small clouds that vanished as fast as they formed. Silas sat down in the snow. He did not cry. The cold was too deep for tears. It froze everything. The moisture in his nostrils, the breath in his throat, the grief that sat in his chest like a stone too heavy to move. He sat there long enough for his fingers to go numb, long enough for the cold to start working its way through his coat, through his shirt, into the skin and muscle beneath, long enough for the prairie to remind him, with its patient brutality, that a man who sat still out here in December would not sit still for long. Copper pressed against his side. The dog's warmth was startling, a point of heat in all that cold, steady and insistent. Copper did not try to move him. He did not bark or pull at his sleeve the way dogs do in stories. He simply stayed. He pressed his body against Silas's side, and he breathed and he waited, and his warmth said what his mouth could not. I am here. I am not leaving. You are not alone in this. And then Lenora was there. She did not speak. She did not ask what had happened. She simply knelt in the snow beside him and placed Emmett in his lap. The baby was bundled in every blanket they owned, only his face visible. And his eyes were open, and his hand reached up and found Silas's finger and gripped it with the blind, absolute trust of a creature who had never known a world where his father did not keep him safe. Silas looked at his son. He looked at the straw house behind them, solid and still against the gray sky. He looked at the prairie stretching in every direction, empty and indifferent and utterly without mercy. My father taught me to build, he said. His voice cracked on the word father. I will teach my son. He stood up. He carried Emmett back inside. Copper followed. The grief did not leave. It settled into the walls the way the cold never could. And some nights Silas would lie awake and listen to the wind and think about his father sitting in his chair by the stove with a book in his hands and wonder if the last thing the old man had thought about was his son out on the Nebraska prairie trying to keep a baby alive in a house made of straw. But he did not stop. He could not stop. There was too much to do, and winter was not finished with them yet. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Lenora made a small pudding from flour and dried berries, and they ate it by the stove while Copper lay at their feet, and Emmett slept in his cradle wrapped in warmth that cost $2 to build. Silas carved a wooden horse for the baby from a piece of cottonwood. It was rough work, nothing like the smooth pieces his father had made, but it was made with the same hands and the same intent. And when he set it beside the cradle, Lenora looked at him and said nothing, and her silence held more than any words could have. On New Year's Day, Silas stood outside in the cold and looked at the straw house and made a resolution. He would not merely survive this winter, he would understand it. He would learn what his walls could do, and he would remember every detail, every temperature, every wind speed, every crack in the plaster, and how it formed and how he fixed it, so that when the time came to teach his son, he would have more than instinct. He would have knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could be passed down, the way his father had passed down the lesson about hollow stalks without ever knowing where it would lead. January came, and with it came the signs. Silas noticed them on January 7th. Copper would not settle. The dog paced the length of the house, back and forth, pausing at the door to whine and then turning and pacing again. He had never done this before. Through every storm, every cold snap, every howling night since August, Copper had been calm. He had lain beside Emmett's cradle with the patience of a creature born to guard, but on the 7th of January, something had changed. The dog knew something the humans did not. On the 8th, the birds flew wrong. Silas saw them from the window, a flock of prairie sparrows moving south-southwest in a tight, panicked formation. They were not migrating. Migration was orderly, purposeful. This was flight. This was escape. He checked the barometer, the small brass instrument he had bought secondhand in Alliance for 60 cents. It had dropped overnight, not the gradual decline that preceded an ordinary storm. A plunge. The kind of drop that meant the air itself was being pushed aside by something enormous moving in from the north. On the morning of the 9th, the sky turned the color of a bruise. Not gray, not white. A sickly yellow-brown that seemed to pulse at the edges, as if the atmosphere itself were swelling with something it could not contain. Silas put on his coat and walked to the Bergstrom claim, 3 miles northeast. He found Niels splitting wood behind his frame house. "A storm is coming," Silas said. "A bad one. Worse than anything this winter." Bergstrom looked at the sky. He shrugged. "Could be. Could pass north of us. Hard to say. My barometer has dropped further than I have ever seen it. The dog will not settle. The birds are flying wrong." Bergstrom drove his axe into the splitting stump and straightened. "Drummond, I have been on this prairie for 20 years. I have seen storms come, and I have seen storms go. And I have learned one thing. Worrying about weather is like worrying about God. It does what it does, and you survive it, or you do not. I'm telling you, this is different." Bergstrom picked up his axe. "I appreciate the concern, but I have got wood to split and walls to patch, and I am not going to spend my afternoon panicking because a dog is nervous." Silas walked to the Croft claim next, 2 miles south. Elias was in his barn mending harness leather. Dorrit was inside with Nell. "Something is coming," Silas said. "Tomorrow, maybe the day after. My barometer is reading lower than anything I have seen since we arrived." Croft did not look up from his harness. "I have lived here 13 years, Drummond. I have survived everything this prairie has thrown at me." "You lost your first family to a blizzard," Silas said. The words came out harder than he intended. Croft's hand stopped moving. He looked up at Silas, and his eyes were flat and dangerous. "That is not something you get to say to me. I am not trying to hurt you. I am trying to keep it from happening again." Silas's voice was steady. "I am asking you to bring Dorrit and Nell to my house before the storm hits. The walls will hold. You know they will. You stood inside and felt it yourself." Croft went back to his harness. "I have survived 13 winters in this county. I know what my house can handle." "A sod wall will not hold against what my barometer is telling me," Silas said. "You do not know what is coming. Nobody does." Croft's voice was final. "Go home, Drummond. Take care of your family. I will take care of mine." Silas tried 2 more homesteads on the way back. A young couple named Farnham who had claimed land that fall. They listened politely, the way young people listen to advice they have already decided to ignore. The wife thanked him. The husband said they would be fine. Then the old man. Jessup Rollins lived alone 4 miles north. He was 71 years old and had been on the prairie since before the railroad reached Alliance. He had outlived 2 wives and a son, and he answered his door with a rifle in his hand and a look on his face that said he had stopped expecting good news a long time ago. "A storm is coming," Silas said. "A bad one. You are welcome to shelter with us." Rollins looked at the sky. Then he looked at Silas. "Son, I have lived through more storms than you have lived through years. I appreciate the offer, but I will be fine, right here." "Mr. Rollins, I am serious. This one is different. My barometer has dropped to a reading I have never seen. The animals are not right. The pressure is not right." Rollins smiled. It was a kind smile, the smile of an old man watching a young man worry about things that old men have learned to accept. "Go home, boy. Keep that baby warm. I will see you in the spring." "I hope so, Mr. Rollins," Silas said quietly. "I truly hope so." He walked home in the fading light with Copper beside him. The wind was already picking up, pushing against his back as if the prairie itself were trying to hurry him along. The sky in the north had turned a color he had never seen before, a greenish black that seemed to eat the last of the daylight. It was the color of something that had been building for 1,000 miles and was now arriving. Inevitable and vast, and Silas walked faster, and Copper walked faster, and neither of them looked back. He had warned them, every one of them, and not a single soul had listened. That night, Silas checked the barometer one last time before bed. It had fallen another 1/4 inch. The mercury sat lower in the tube than the manufacturer's lowest printed marking. He stacked fuel beside the stove. He filled every container they owned with water. He sealed the window with rags and checked every inch of plaster for cracks. He ran his hands along the north wall in the dark, feeling for any give, any soft spot, any place where the mud had separated from the straw. There was one crack near the northeast corner, hairline thin, and he packed it with clay and pressed it smooth and held his palm against it until he was certain. He brought Emmett's cradle closer to the stove. He moved the bed so that Lenora would sleep between the wall and the baby, shielded from any draft. He checked the stovepipe joints and cleaned the ash from the grate and laid the fire for morning so that a single match would bring it to life. He did everything he could think of, and then he stood in the middle of the room and tried to think of what he had missed. Copper paced and whined. Emmett slept in his cradle, oblivious and trusting. Lenora watched Silas work. If they had listened, she said, if they had come, they did not listen. And when the storm hits, then they will learn what Elias Croft's father knew when he pressed those bales 11 years ago. Silas paused. He had not told Lenora about the letters on the twine. There had not been a right moment, not after the news about his father, not during the weeks of grief and work and survival that had blurred together like snow and wind. He went to the northwest corner of the house and pulled away a loose piece of interior plaster. Behind it, the bale was visible, dry and golden, undamaged by 11 years of weather because the outer bales had protected it. On the binding twine, barely legible, were the penciled letters. EC Lot 12, 1892. Lenora looked at the markings. She looked at Silas. EC, she said. Ephraim Croft, Elias's father. Silas nodded. He died in the blizzard of 93. These bales were the last thing he ever made. He pressed them in the fall of 92, probably meant to use them for feed or for building, and then winter came and killed him before he could come back for them. Lenora touched the twine with her fingertips. His straw is holding up your walls. His straw is going to hold up a lot more than that before this is over, Silas said. He did not say the rest. He did not say that Ephraim Croft's straw was about to save the life of Ephraim Croft's granddaughter, that the bales a dead man pressed 11 years ago were going to shelter the family of the man who had predicted Silas's baby would freeze, that the chain of knowledge and material ran deeper than anyone in this county could imagine, connecting the dead to the living through 2 feet of compressed grass and trapped air. He did not say it because the storm had not come yet, and until it did, the straw was just straw, and the walls were just walls, and the pig pen was just a joke that the county told at Harlan Sloan's general store while the barometer fell and the sky turned black and the wind began to build. The storm arrived on January 10th, 1904, and it arrived like something alive. The temperature at dawn was 18 degrees above zero, cold but manageable. The sky was a flat gray sheet, featureless and heavy. By 9, the gray had darkened to something that looked like bruised flesh. The barometer had dropped lower than Silas had ever seen it fall. By 10, the wind began. It did not build gradually, it hit all at once. A wall of moving air that slammed into the straw house like a fist. Silas felt the impact through the floor. Lenora grabbed Emmett and pulled him close. Copper pressed against the cradle and growled, not at anything visible, but at the sound itself, at the shrieking fury that had suddenly replaced the silence of the prairie. Then the snow came, not falling snow. Horizontal snow, driven so hard it sounded like gravel striking the walls. The world outside the small south window vanished, not obscured, not dimmed, gone. Replaced by a solid white nothing that moved and screamed and seemed to have no end. The temperature dropped fast. 18 at dawn, 6 below zero by noon, and still falling. Silas watched the numbers descend with the calm attention of a man who has done everything he can and knows that what happens next is between his walls and the wind. Silas fed the stove, steady, patient. The walls did the rest. Inside, 58 degrees. Outside, 14 below. The plaster cracked in 2 places on the north wall, and Silas patched them with mud he had kept mixed and ready in a bucket by the door. He had prepared for this. He had known the north wall would take the worst of it, and he had kept clay and water and grass mixed and waiting for exactly this moment. The wind found every seam, every joint, every microscopic gap in the plaster, and it pushed and probed and tried to force its way through. The walls held. The straw held. The trapped air in 10,000 hollow stalks held the cold at bay the way an army holds a line, not by force, but by sheer, patient, immovable presence. And then, at 2 in the afternoon, with the temperature at 22 below and still falling, and the wind screaming loud enough to drown out thought itself, someone knocked on the door. Silas almost did not hear it. The storm was too loud, too consuming, too complete in its assault on every sense. But Copper heard it. The dog's head snapped toward the door, and his ears went forward, and he barked once, sharp and urgent, and Silas crossed the room and pulled the door open against the wind. Elias Croft stood in the doorway covered in ice. His face was white, not pale. White, the color of a man whose blood has retreated from his skin to save his core. Behind him, barely visible through the driving snow, stood Dorrit, clutching a bundle to her chest. The bundle moved. Nell, 3 years old, wrapped in every blanket the Crofts owned. "Our house," Croft said. His voice was thin and cracked. The north wall, the weight of the snow. It collapsed. Silas grabbed him by the arm and pulled him inside. Dorrit stumbled through the door after him. The warm air hit them, and Dorrit's knees buckled, and Lenora caught her and took Nell from her shaking arms. 5 months ago, Dorrit had stood in this same doorway, steady and capable, delivering Emmett into the world. Now she could not stand. "The stovepipe came down when the wall fell," Dorrit whispered. "The fire went out. We could not." She stopped. She looked around the room. Her eyes went wide. "It is warm," she said. Her voice broke on the word, as if warmth were something she had forgotten existed. An hour later, another pounding at the door. Niels Bergstrom, his wife Ingrid, and their 2 sons, Carl and Anders, ice-crusted and staggering. Their frame house, the one Bergstrom had built with such pride, with lumber shipped from Chicago at great expense, had proven no match for the cold. The gaps in the walls, invisible in autumn, had become highways for the killing wind. The stove could not keep up. The temperature inside had fallen to 20 degrees, then 15, then 10. And Bergstrom had gathered his family and made the decision that would save their lives. "I remembered what you said," Bergstrom told Silas. His voice shook. "I remembered your walls." Then the Farnham couple, the young homesteaders, half frozen and weeping. Their sod house had collapsed entirely. The wife's hands were bleeding. The husband could not stop shaking. They said nothing about how they had made it. They did not need to. The blood on her palms said enough. Then a man Silas did not recognize at first. A ranch hand named Virgil Poe, who had been caught on the open prairie when the storm hit. He had followed the faint glow of the straw house's window through a 1/4 mile of white nothing until his frozen hands found the door. He fell through it without speaking and lay on the floor and did not move for several minutes, and Silas thought he might be dead until the man's chest rose and fell and rose again. And last, a pounding so faint, Silas almost missed it. He opened the door, and the wind drove a figure through it like something thrown. The figure hit the floor on hands and knees and stayed there, shaking. When he lifted his face, Silas knew him. Wick Saunders, the red-faced boy from the feedlot who had ridden out on a Sunday with his friends and called across the claim, "Hey Drummond, when does the wolf come to blow it down?" The boy who had bet $1 the house would not last till October. Saunders could not speak. His lips were split, and his face was raw, and his eyes held the blank terror of a man who had spent an hour in the open at 40 below and understood for the first time in his life that the world did not care whether he lived or died. He looked up at Silas from the floor, and his mouth moved, but nothing came out. Silas pulled him to his feet and sat him by the stove. 15 people. 1 straw house. 16 feet by 20 feet. Silas opened the door for every one of them. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say, "I warned you." He did not ask for apologies or gratitude or acknowledgement. He said the same thing to each frozen figure that stumbled out of the white nothing and into the warmth of the house that the county had called the pig pen. "Come in, get warm." 15 people in a space built for 3. Silas counted them as the storm screamed outside. Himself and Lenora and Emmett, Elias and Dorrit and little Nell. Niels Bergstrom and his wife Ingrid and their 2 sons, Carl and Anders, 12 and 9. The Farnham couple, young and terrified, still shaking from their crawl through the blizzard. Virgil Poe, the ranch hand, barely conscious on the floor. And Wick Saunders, the feedlot boy who had bet $1 this house would fall, sitting by the stove with his split lips and his ruined pride and his eyes that could not stop staring at the walls that had saved him. 15 people, 1 stove, 1 fuel pile that had been calculated to last a family of 3 through winter and was now being asked to keep 15 souls alive. Silas did what needed to be done. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for consensus. He moved through the crowded room with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent months learning every corner of this space, every draft, every warm spot, every cold pocket where the air did not quite circulate. Children closest to the stove. Emmett's cradle was already there. He moved Nell beside it, still wrapped in her blankets, her small face pale, and her eyes enormous and empty in a way that made Silas's stomach clench. The Bergstrom boys sat against the south wall where the residual warmth from the day's weak sunlight still held in the plaster. The adults arranged themselves around the perimeter, sharing blankets, sharing body heat, sharing the strange intimacy of survival. Virgil Poe's hands were the worst. The ranch hand had been on horseback when the storm struck, and his gloves had been thin leather, good enough for riding, useless against 40 below. His fingers were bloodless from the second knuckle to the tip, rigid and waxy, and when Silas knelt to examine them, Poe did not flinch, because there was nothing left to feel. Silas knew what to do. His father had taught him this on a February morning in Ohio when a neighbor's boy had come to the door with ears the color of tallow. "You warm, frozen flesh slowly," his father had said. "Not fast. You warm it too quickly, and the tissue dies. You warm it slowly, and the blood comes back on its own, carrying heat into the damaged cells, the way a river carries spring into a frozen valley." He filled a basin with water that was warm but not hot. He guided Poe's hands into it. The ranch hand's jaw clenched and the tendons in his neck stood out like rope, and a sound came from his throat that was not quite a scream and not quite a moan, but something between the two. The sound of a man whose body is remembering pain after hours of numbness. "Easy," Silas said. "The blood is coming back. That means the tissue is alive. If it did not hurt, that would be worse." Poe nodded once. His eyes were wet, but his hands stayed in the water. Dorrit Croft was next. Her toes were white at the tips, the early stages of frostbite that could cost her 2 or 3 of them if the circulation did not return. Lenora knelt beside her and wrapped her feet in damp, warm cloth, working slowly, methodically, the way Silas had shown her. Dorrit hissed through her teeth. The pain of returning blood was worse than the numbness of the cold, and her hands gripped the chair until her knuckles matched the white of her frozen toes. Elias watched from across the room. He said nothing. His face was the face of a man who has arrived at a place he swore he would never need and does not yet know what to do with the knowledge of being there. Lenora organized the food. They had flour, salt, dried beans, a small store of jerky, and the remains of a rabbit Silas had trapped 3 days earlier. It was not enough for 15 people. It was not close to enough. But Lenora portioned it with the careful precision of a woman who understood that the difference between life and death was sometimes measured in tablespoons. "Nobody gets seconds," she said. "Nobody takes more than their share. We do not know how long this storm will last." Nobody argued. There was something in her voice, a quiet authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the fact that she was standing in a house she had helped build, feeding people from stores she had helped gather, and every person in the room understood without being told that this woman had earned the right to say how things would be. She heated water on the stove and made a thin broth from the rabbit bones. Not much nourishment, but warmth in a cup. And warmth was its own kind of food. She gave the first cups to the children. Carl Bergstrom took his with both hands and drank without speaking, and his younger brother Anders did the same, and the Farnham wife accepted hers with tears running down her face and could not say thank you and did not need to. The first night was the longest. The temperature outside dropped to 30 below zero, then 34, then 38. Inside, the stove burned steady, and the walls did what walls made of straw and trapped air do. They held. The temperature settled at 54 degrees. Not warm enough for comfort. Warm enough for life. Silas fed the stove one chip at a time. He had learned over the months that this house did not need much. A steady feed, a patient approach. The walls did the rest. But the fuel pile was shrinking faster than he had planned, and every chip he placed in the fire was a chip that would not be there tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that. He did the arithmetic in his head. 15 people, 3 days of fuel at this rate. Maybe 4 if the wind shifted and the temperature climbed even a few degrees. If the storm lasted longer than 4 days, they would have to start burning furniture. He did not share this calculation with anyone. Some numbers are better kept in the dark. Emmett got sick on the second night. It started with a cough. Silas heard it in the darkness, a small wet sound that did not belong in the warm room, a sound that cut through the breathing of 13 other people and found its way to a father's ear the way a distress signal finds a receiver tuned to its exact frequency. By morning, the cough had deepened and the baby's forehead burned against Lenora's palm. "Fever," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the crowded room, everyone heard. Silas's blood went cold in a way the storm could not match. Babies died from fevers. Babies died all the time on the frontier, from illnesses that had no name and no cure and no mercy. The nearest doctor was in Alliance, 18 miles away, across a frozen wasteland that would kill any man who tried to cross it. They could not get help. They could not get medicine. All they could do was keep Emmett warm and cool his forehead with damp cloth and wait for the fever to break or not break and hope that the same walls holding back the cold could somehow hold back what was happening inside a 5-month-old boy's body. Copper had not left the baby's side since the storm began. The dog lay pressed against the cradle, his copper coat rising and falling with each breath, his body heat radiating into the small space where Emmett coughed and whimpered and burned. When Lenora lifted the baby to nurse him, Copper shifted to stay in contact, pressing his nose against the blankets, against the tiny feet, against any part of the child he could reach. As if he understood that the warmth he offered was not medicine, but was not nothing either. Lenora sang. It was a song her mother had sung to her, something old and quiet and shapeless, more breath than melody, a song that had no proper beginning and no proper end, but simply existed the way lullabies exist, passed from one woman to the next, across generations, that never thought to write it down, because some things live in the voice and die on the page. She sang it into Emmett's hair while the storm raged and the straw stood firm, and 15 people listened in the half-dark and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was more true than a mother singing to a sick child. The Bergstrom boys fell asleep against each other like two cards leaning together. Young Farnham held his wife and stared at the ceiling. Virgil Poe sat with his back against the wall and his hat over his eyes and did not move for hours. His hands, still wrapped in damp cloth, rested in his lap like sleeping animals. And Nell Croft did not speak. She had not spoken since her parents carried her through the blizzard. She sat where Silas had placed her, beside Emmett's cradle, wrapped in blankets, her eyes open but unfocused, her small hands motionless in her lap. Dorrit tried to hold her. Nell did not resist, but she did not respond either. She was there, and she was not there, present in body and absent in everything else, and her silence filled the room in ways the storm could not. Dorrit looked at Silas across the room, and he saw in her eyes the terror of a mother watching her child disappear while still sitting right in front of her. He had no words for her. He had no remedy. The cold outside could be held by walls, but the cold inside a 3-year-old girl who had been carried through a blizzard and watched her house collapse was a different kind of cold entirely, and Silas did not know if any wall in the world could hold against that. It was Copper who reached her. On the second night, as the wind screamed and the temperature outside plunged to 40 below, and Emmett's fever climbed and the fuel pile shrank, and the adults sat in the heavy silence of people who were beginning to understand that survival was not guaranteed, Copper stood up from his place beside the cradle. He stretched once, the way dogs do, front paws forward and back arched. Then he walked across the room to where Nell sat motionless in her blankets. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply lay down beside her, pressed his body against her side, and rested his chin on her lap. Nell did not react, not at first. She sat rigid, her hands still, her eyes still empty. Copper breathed. His ribs expanded and contracted against her side, warm and rhythmic and alive. His chin was heavy on her small thighs, a weight that was also an anchor, a presence that said without words what words could not have said. I am here. I am not leaving. You do not have to come back all at once. You can come back one breath at a time. A minute passed, then another. The room was quiet except for the wind in the stove and the sound of Copper breathing. Then Nell's hand moved, slowly, as if the muscles had forgotten how. Her fingers found Copper's ear and touched it, felt the velvet fold of it, traced the edge from base to tip. And something in her face changed. The emptiness cracked. The blankness shifted. Her fingers curled into Copper's fur and held on, and her chest hitched once, twice, and then she was crying, silently. Tears running down her face and into the dog's coat, and her mouth opened and she said her first words in 2 days. Doggy warm. Dorrit made a sound that was not quite a sob, and not quite a laugh, and not quite a prayer, but somehow all three at once. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and her shoulders shook, and Elias put his arm around her and pulled her close, and his own eyes were bright with something he would not let fall. Across the room, Ingrid Bergstrom wiped her face with the back of her hand. Young Farnham's wife turned away. Even Virgil Poe, the ranch hand who had spoken perhaps 10 words since arriving, lowered his hat and was still. Nell's fingers stayed in Copper's fur. The dog did not move. He breathed against her, warm and steady and patient, and the child who had gone silent in the cold found her voice again in the warmth of an animal who had also once been abandoned and left to die. Now here is a thing worth remembering. 15 people in a room built for 3. A dog who had been thrown away, saving a child who had nearly been lost. If that is not proof that the broken things of this world still have purpose, I do not know what is. Niels Bergstrom spoke on the second night. The children were asleep. Nell had finally closed her eyes with her hand still buried in Copper's coat. Emmett's fever held but had not climbed further. The adults sat in the dim glow of the stove and listened to the storm that had not weakened, had not shifted, had not shown any sign of ending. "I was the one who said the cows would think you built them a feed trough," Bergstrom said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the confidence Silas had heard in it back in June. "I was the one who said the first hard wind would scatter your bales across the county." He looked at the straw walls, at the plaster that Silas had applied with bare hands, at the room that held 54 degrees, while the world outside tried to kill everything it touched. I was wrong about everything. Silas said nothing. There was nothing to say. The walls said it for him. The Farnham wife spoke next. She was young, maybe 20, and her voice shook, but her words did not. She said that when their sod house collapsed, she had thought they were going to die. She said her husband had pulled her from under the broken wall, and she had looked out at the blizzard and seen nothing. No light, no shape, no direction, nothing but white that moved and screamed. She said her husband had grabbed the fence wire and said, "Follow me," and they had crawled. She said the wire had torn through her gloves and cut her palms, and she had kept crawling because the only alternative was to stop, and stopping meant dying, and she was 20 years old, and she was not ready. She held up her bandaged hands. The blood had seeped through the cloth in thin lines. "We crawled for an hour," she said, "maybe longer. I could not feel my knees. I could not feel my face. The only thing I could feel was the wire in my hands and my husband's boot in front of me. And then the wire ended. And I thought that was it. I thought we had reached the end of the fence, and there was nothing beyond it. And we were going to die in the snow, 50 feet from something we could not see." She paused. Her husband put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and continued. "But then I saw the light. Your window. Through the snow. It was so small. Like a candle a mile away. But it was there. And my husband said that is the straw house. The one they all laugh about. And I thought, if it is still standing in this storm, then maybe there is something inside it worth crawling toward." She looked at Silas. "We crawled toward your light." Elias Croft did not speak that night. He sat with Dorrit and held her and watched his daughter sleep against a dog and said nothing. But sometime after midnight, when the fire had burned low and the room was lit only by the faint glow of coals and the sound of breathing filled the space like a kind of music, Silas crossed the room and sat down beside him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of binding twine. He had cut it from the bale in the northwest corner, the bale with the pencil marks, and he had kept it in his pocket since the night he showed it to Lenora. He handed it to Elias. Croft took the twine and held it close to the stove light. His eyes moved across the faded pencil marks. E.C. Lot 12, 1892. And then his hands stopped. His breathing stopped. Everything about him went still in the way that a man goes still when the ground shifts beneath his feet, and the world he thought he understood rearranges itself into something he does not recognize. "E.C.," Croft whispered. "Ephraim Croft," Silas said. "Your father pressed these bales in the fall of 1892. He marked each one, numbered them. He must have planned to come back for them in the spring. But there was no spring, not for Ephraim Croft. The blizzard of '93 had taken him before the snow melted, and the bales he pressed had sat by the creek for 11 years, waiting. Croft held the twine in both hands. His fingers trembled. Not from cold. The room was warm. His fingers trembled because he was holding his father's handwriting. The last thing his father's hands had made before the prairie took him. And that handwriting was on a piece of twine that had held together a bale of straw that was right now, at this very moment, keeping his granddaughter alive. He did not cry immediately. Silas watched something move through the man's face, something deeper than grief, deeper than surprise, something that traveled from the twine in his hands to the walls around him, to the sleeping child across the room, and connected all of it in a single unbroken line from the dead to the living. "My father pressed this straw," Croft said. His voice was barely audible. "Yes. 11 years ago. Yes. And it is holding up your walls. It is holding up more than that," Silas said. He looked at Nell, asleep with her hand in Copper's fur. "It is holding up your daughter." Elias Croft lowered his head. The twine hung between his fingers like a rosary. His shoulders shook once, then again. Then he was crying, silently, the way men cry who have not cried in years and have forgotten how. And Silas sat beside him and did not touch him and did not speak, because some grief is too large for comfort, and some revelations are too heavy for words. "My father," Croft said, and then he could not say anything else. Outside, the storm raged. The wind screamed. The temperature fell to 41 below zero, and the snow buried the world in white silence. Inside, the straw did what straw does. It held the air. The air held the warmth. The warmth held them all. Silas fed the stove, one chip at a time, steady, patient. Dawn came on the third day. It came slowly, a gradual lightening at the edges of the south window, as if the sun were not sure it was safe to return. The wind had stopped, not died down, stopped completely. The silence was so total that Silas could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Copper's breathing, could hear the last ember in the stove ticking as it cooled. He crossed to the window and scraped frost from the glass with his thumbnail. The world outside was white and motionless. Snow had drifted to the roofline on the north side. The sky was pale blue, hard and clean. The kind of blue that only comes after a storm has spent everything it has and moved on. The sun sat low on the horizon, and the snow caught its light and threw it back in a glare that made Silas squint after 3 days of dimness. He checked the thermometer, 41 below zero. Inside, 52 degrees. The fire had burned down to coals. The fuel pile was more than half gone, but they were alive. All of them. Lenora's hand found his arm. He turned. She was holding Emmett, and she was smiling, and Silas looked at the baby and saw what she had already seen. The fever had broken. Emmett's forehead was cool. His eyes were clear and focused, and they found his father's face, and the baby smiled the way babies smile, without reason, without context, simply because something in the world is warm and familiar and worth smiling at. He reached for his father's face with one small hand, and Silas caught it and held it and felt the warmth of his son's skin against his palm and closed his eyes. From across the room, a small voice. "Can I keep petting the dog?" Nell Croft, 3 years old, awake and speaking and alive, with her fingers still tangled in Copper's fur. Dorrit laughed. It came out broken and wet, and not quite like a laugh at all, but everyone in the room understood what it was. It was the sound of a woman who had carried her daughter through a blizzard and watched her go silent, and spent 2 days not knowing if the child inside the blankets would ever come back. And now the child was asking to pet a dog. And that was the most beautiful sentence in the English language. You can pet him as long as you like, sweetheart. Copper's tail thumped once against the floor, slow and deliberate, as if he too understood that something had been decided, something had turned, and the worst was behind them now. 15 people, 15 lives, one straw house that cost $2 to build. Silas opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical weight, pressing against his chest, burning in his nostrils. He could feel his nostril hairs freeze with each breath. The air itself seemed to crackle with the depth of its cold, 41 below, a number that had no meaning until you stood in it and felt it try to pull the warmth from your blood through your skin. And yet standing in that impossible freeze, he could feel warmth on his back. The open door behind him was leaking heat into the frozen morning, heat that his straw walls had held through 3 days of the worst storm in a decade. He looked at the house, at the rough plaster, cracked in places but unbroken, at the walls that had been mocked as animal feed, as a fairy tale, as a death sentence for his family. Snow had drifted to the roof line on the north side. The south wall was scoured clean by the wind, the plaster pale and streaked but solid. Not a single bale had shifted. Not a single stake had given. The house stood exactly as he had built it, exactly as his father's knowledge had designed it, and the prairie stretched away from it in every direction, white and silent and utterly defeated. $2 and a dead man's straw, and the walls held. Elias Croft emerged an hour later. He stood beside Silas in the bitter cold, both men shivering despite their coats, and looked at the straw walls that had saved his family. He did not talk about lumber prices or construction methods. Bergstrom had already spoken those words. What Croft said was something only he could say. I told you that baby was going to freeze to death in your arms. I said that to a man I did not know, about a child I had never held, because I was so certain the prairie would take them the way it took mine. He paused. The morning light was hard on his face. It showed every line, every year, every winter that had carved itself into his skin. I was not warning you, Drummond. I was punishing you for having the nerve to hope when I had given up hoping a long time ago. His eyes moved to the wall, to the place where, behind the plaster, his father's twine still held a bale of straw that had kept his daughter breathing through 3 nights of killing cold. My father pressed that straw. My daughter slept inside it, and the man I tried to scare away from this prairie is the one who put the two together. Croft's voice broke. I do not have words big enough for what I owe you. Silas looked at the man who had predicted his family's death, the man who had ridden away without offering help, the man who had shown up at his door, half frozen with his daughter silent in his wife's arms. Begging for shelter, he said Silas would never be able to provide. The man whose father's hands had made the very walls that held them all. Come inside, Silas said. I will draw you a plan. Niels Bergstrom found Silas 2 days later, after the roads had opened enough for travel. He brought a gift. A young mule, barely 2 years old, strong and healthy. My brother sent it from Iowa, Bergstrom explained. Was supposed to be a draft animal for spring plowing, but I figure you need it more than I do after what you did for my family. Silas tried to refuse. Bergstrom would not hear it. You saved my boys, Bergstrom said. His voice was thick. I watched them getting cold in our house, watched the temperature dropping, watched them start to shiver in ways that scared me. And I thought about what you had built, and I thought maybe, just maybe, you were smarter than all of us. He pressed the mule's lead rope into Silas's hand. My boys slept warm because of your walls, Bergstrom said. Carl told me this morning that he was not afraid, not once, not even when the wind was loudest. He said the house felt like it was holding them. You brought pickled beets, Silas said, back in the summer, when you had every reason to write me off as a fool. Bergstrom almost smiled. My wife said you had good hands, said the way you drove those stakes, the way you laid those bales, you were not just guessing, you were thinking. Virgil Poe, the ranch hand, left a hunting knife on the doorstep without a word. It was a good knife, well-oiled, sharp, worth more than Poe probably had in his pocket. Silas found it in the morning with no note, no explanation. He never learned for certain who left it. He did not need to. Wick Saunders came back 3 days after the storm. He stood at the edge of the claim with his hat in his hands and his head down, and he did not come closer until Silas walked out to meet him. The red-faced bravado was gone. The boy who had bet $1 the house would fall looked 10 years older than the boy who had ridden out on a Sunday with a bottle and a laugh. I owe you my life, Saunders said. His voice was raw. And I owe you an apology for every word I ever said about this place. Silas studied the young man. He thought about the Sunday afternoon, the laughter, the wolf joke, the dollar bet. He thought about Saunders on the floor of the straw house, unable to speak, staring at the walls with the blank terror of a man who had just learned that everything he thought he knew was wrong. You owe me nothing, Silas said. But if you want to learn how to build one of these, come back in spring with a wagon and some bales. Saunders nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked away. He came back in April with 2 wagons and 12 bales, and he did not leave until he knew how to stake them. But not everyone was saved. On the second day after the storm broke, Silas and Elias rode out to check the homesteads. They rode the new mule and one of Bergstrom's horses, moving through snow that reached the animals' chests in places, following fence lines and wagon ruts, and the memory of where roads used to be before the white erased everything. They found Jessup Rollins on the floor of his cabin 4 miles north. The old man was sitting upright against the wall with his rifle across his lap and his coat buttoned to the throat and his eyes open and his skin the color of old paper. The fire in his stove had gone out. The ash was cold. Rollins had frozen in his chair the way cattle freeze standing in fields, so gradually that by the time the cold reached his heart, he probably did not feel it anymore. There was a cup on the table beside him. Coffee. Frozen solid. He had been drinking coffee when the fire died, and at some point the cold had crossed a line, and the old man's body had simply stopped, quietly, the way a clock stops when the spring unwinds. Silas stood in the doorway and looked at the old man who had smiled at him and called him son and told him to go home and keep that baby warm. I warned him, Silas said. His voice was flat. I stood right here and told him a storm was coming. I told him it would be bad. I offered him shelter. Croft put his hand on Silas's shoulder. You cannot save a man who will not be saved. He did not need to die. No, he did not. Croft's voice was heavy, but he chose to stay. That was his choice, not yours. They closed his eyes. They covered him with his own blanket. They rode back in silence through the white fields, and neither man spoke about what they had seen, and both men thought about it for the rest of their lives. They buried Jessup Rollins when the ground thawed enough to accept a shovel. It was not until spring. Silas thought about the old man more often than he expected. He thought about the smile and the rifle and the quiet certainty of a man who had outlived everything except his own stubbornness. He thought about the difference between courage and pride and how sometimes the line between them was so thin that a man could cross it without knowing and never find his way back. Rollins did not need to die. That thought stayed with Silas for the rest of his life, not as guilt, as weight. The weight of knowing that your hands can build walls that hold, but your voice cannot always reach the people who need them. Harlan Sloan never came back to offer $50. Silas saw him once in Alliance late in February when he walked to town for supplies. Sloan was standing outside his general store watching the street, and his eyes found Silas and held. Neither man spoke. Sloan's expression was unreadable. Not angry, not impressed, just calculating. The way he always calculated. The cost of lumber versus the cost of straw. The value of a claim versus the value of a reputation. The profit in failure versus the loss. When a fool turned out to be right. Silas nodded once, politely, and walked on. He never learned what Sloan thought about the straw house that refused to fall. He never asked. Some men do not change. They do not apologize. They do not arrive at your door in the cold asking to be let in. They simply recalculate and move on, and the space where their acknowledgement should have been remains empty, and you learn to build around it the way you build around a rock in a field. It is there. You cannot move it. You plow around it and plant what you can, and the crop grows anyway. The letter from his mother arrived in March. Silas had been expecting another letter, eventually. He had been expecting grief, more details about the funeral, perhaps a request that he come home. What he was not expecting was the paragraph near the bottom of the second page, written in his mother's careful hand, that changed the shape of everything he thought he had lost. Your father received a letter from a Mr. Sloan of Alliance, Nebraska, some weeks before he passed. The letter described your house in terms that were not kind. Your father read it at the kitchen table. I expected him to be upset. I expected him to worry. Instead, he laughed. He laughed so hard I thought something was wrong with him. When I asked what was funny, he handed me the letter and said, "The boy remembered the straw. He remembered what I told him about the straw." And then he said, "I knew he would be all right." Any man who listened well enough to remember that lesson will figure out the rest. Silas read the paragraph 3 times. Then he sat down on the floor of the straw house and held the letter in both hands and wept. Not from grief, not this time. From something larger than grief and quieter than joy. His father had read Sloan's letter. His father had learned that his son was building a house out of straw bales on the Nebraska prairie, and his father had not been ashamed, had not been worried, had not seen madness or failure or pride. His father had laughed, because his father understood, because his father knew that the knowledge he had passed down, the lessons about hollow stalks and trapped air and the warmth that lives inside things that look like nothing, had found their way into hands that knew what to do with them. The boy remembered the straw. I knew he would be all right. His father had died believing that. His father had died proud. Silas folded the letter and placed it inside the family Bible beside the pressed wildflower Lenora had picked on their first day in Nebraska. He never showed it to anyone except Lenora. He never spoke about it publicly. But for the rest of his life, when things were hard, when the winter pressed in and the work was heavy and the world seemed determined to prove that a man's best efforts were never enough, Silas Drummond would open that Bible and read those 2 sentences and remember that the man who mattered most had known the truth before anyone else. The walls held, and his father had known they would. Spring came. Silas taught anyone who wanted to learn. No charge, no secrets. Just show up with bales, and I will show you what to do. By April, 5 new straw bale structures were rising across Box Butte County. Small buildings at first. A chicken coop here, a storage shed there, as people tested the method before committing to a full house. Silas helped with all of them. He showed them how to stake the bales, how to stagger the joints, how to mix the mud plaster with prairie grass for strength. He answered every question with patience, and never once said the words that he had earned the right to say. "I told you so. Why do you not charge for it?" Lenora asked him one evening as they watched Emmett crawling across the floor, pulling himself along with the determined concentration of a boy who had decided that walking was something he intended to do soon. "Because Elias Croft did not charge me when he was wrong," Silas said. "He rode over to tell me my baby would freeze, and he was wrong, and he admitted it, and he did not ask for anything in return. If a man can admit he was wrong for free, I can teach what I know for free." Lenora began teaching the homesteader children to read in the straw house that fall. She cleared a corner and hung a slate board Niels Bergstrom had brought from Alliance and sat the children in a half circle on the floor and taught them their letters while the walls held the warmth and copper lay beside the smallest ones, and the stove crackled and the world outside did what it had always done and always would. The years passed the way years pass on the prairie, slowly and all at once. Emmett grew into a strong boy and then a stronger man. He learned to stack bales before he learned to ride a horse. By the time he was 16, he had helped build 11 straw bale houses across 3 counties, and by the time he was 20, he was doing it on his own, hiring himself out to homesteaders who had heard about the Drummond method and wanted walls that could hold through anything the Nebraska winter could throw at them. He never charged more than a man could afford. Some jobs he did for free. His father had taught him that too. Nell Croft grew up in the shadow of the straw house that saved her life. She remembered nothing of the blizzard itself. She remembered warmth. She remembered the feel of fur beneath her fingers. When she was 19, she wrote a small book about straw bale construction, illustrating it with her own drawings, detailed and precise, each one labeled in a hand that was steady, the way her grandfather Ephraim's hand had been steady when he marked twine in a field 11 years before she was born. On the first page, she wrote a dedication that made Elias weep for the second time in his life, for Ephraim Croft, who pressed the straw and never knew how many lives it would hold. Copper died in the spring of 1916. He was 13 years old, ancient for a dog of his size, and he died the way he had lived, quietly, without fuss, lying in his spot beside the place where Emmett's cradle had once stood. His breathing slowed through the morning. Emmett sat beside him with his hand on the dog's side, feeling each breath come slower and shallower than the one before, and at some point in the early afternoon, the breathing stopped and Copper was still, and the warmth began to leave his body the way it never left the walls. Emmett was 13. He carried the dog outside by himself because he said it was something he needed to do alone. He buried Copper beneath the cottonwood near the creek where Lenora had found him, tied to a post 13 years before, ribs showing and tail still wagging. A dog who had been thrown away and did not know it yet. He carved a headstone from a piece of sandstone and chiseled 5 words into it. He kept us warm. The family stood around the grave, and the wind moved through the grass, and Silas put his hand on his son's shoulder and said nothing because some things do not need to be said. Lenora placed a handful of wildflowers on the turned earth. Nell Croft, 16 now and as tall as her mother, knelt and touched the headstone and whispered something no one else heard. Lenora died in 1937. The Depression had thinned the county, but had not broken it, and the straw houses stood through those years the way they stood through everything, holding warmth when fuel was scarce, holding families together when the economy tried to tear them apart. Silas buried his wife beside the cottonwood, 20 feet from Copper's headstone, and he continued alone. An old man in a house that visitors sometimes mistook for an ordinary farmstead until they touched the walls and felt how thick they were, how solid, how still, how warm in winter, how cool in summer, how alive with the memory of everything they had held. He was sitting on the porch one afternoon in the fall of 1955 when his grandson, Emmett's eldest boy, sat down beside him. The boy was 12, the same age Carl Bergstrom had been on the night of the blizzard, and he had the same steady eyes that Silas had seen in his own father's face a lifetime ago in Ohio. The Shetty looked at the straw walls and asked the question Silas had been waiting 52 years to hear. "Did you really build this house out of straw, Grandpa? Were you not scared?" Silas looked at the walls, at the plaster, patched and repatched over half a century, cracked in places and smooth in others, solid as the day he had first spread creek mud across compressed grass with his bare hands. He looked at the porch post where copper used to lean, at the window that had been a faint light in a blizzard, the light the Farnhams had crawled toward, at the south wall where Lenora had hung the slate board and taught children to read while the stove crackled and the dog dozed and the world outside raged. "I was scared every single day that first winter," he said. "Every single day. But your grandmother told me something I have never forgotten. She said I was not building because my father taught me. She said I was building because I listened. And she was right. That was the difference. Not what my father knew, what I heard." The boy was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass the way it had moved for 100 years and would move for 100 more. "Will you teach me, Grandpa? Will you teach me how to listen like that?" Silas smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in a long time, and it felt like something thawing. Something that had been frozen not by cold, but by the sheer accumulation of years and loss and memory. And the smile cracked through all of it the way spring cracks through the last ice on the creek. "I will teach you everything," he said. Silas Drummond died in 1956 at the age of 78. He died in the straw house, in the bed he had built from cottonwood, in the warmth that had never failed him. The house was still standing. In 1994, a researcher named David Eisenberg examined the Drummond house as part of a study on alternative building materials. He found the bales as sound as the day they had been stacked. The straw had not rotted, had not crumbled, had not compressed. 91 years of Nebraska weather, 91 winters, 91 springs of snowmelt and rain and humidity, and the straw had simply endured, dry and solid and waiting, the way it had waited through that January blizzard and every winter since. He measured the interior temperature on a January afternoon when the outside air read 4 degrees below zero. The house, unheated, held at 42 degrees. Exactly what Silas had recorded in his journal in 1903 when he let the fire die to test his walls in the dark of an autumn night. On the walls, if you knew where to look, you could still find the faded pencil marks on the binding twine. E.C. Lot, 12, 1892, Ephraim Croft's handwriting. A dead man's last act of preparation for a winter he would not survive, pressed into bales that would save his son's family 11 years later and stand for nearly a century after that. The house cost $2 to build. It saved 15 lives in a single night. It stood for 91 years. And inside its walls, through drought and blizzard and depression and war, the temperature held steady the way a promise holds steady when the person who made it means every word. The walls held. If you are facing your own storm right now, if the people around you are calling your efforts foolish and your choices insane and your house a pig pen, remember Silas Drummond. Remember Lenora singing to a sick baby while 13 strangers listened. Remember a copper-colored dog who walked across a crowded room and lay down beside a silent child and brought her back. Remember that sometimes the thing everyone calls garbage is the thing that saves your life. And remember that the knowledge passed down from those who came before us, the quiet lessons taught in haylofts and kitchens and workshops and front porches, does not die when they do. It waits. It waits in the walls. It waits in the twine. It waits for the hands that know what to do with it. And when the storm comes, the walls hold.